Welcome to Method and Madness.
This is an ongoing conversation about great books hosted by writers Aaron Gwynn and Brad Kelly.
In each series, we figure out what makes a book like Moby Dick or Blood Meridian worth reading,
And how writers might learn from it in order to master their craft.
We'll also explore the labyrinth that lies beneath the novel
And find out what it means to our most insightful friends. I want my learned readers to participate in the scene I'm about to replay. I want them to examine its every detail and see for themselves how careful, how chaste, the whole wine-sweet event is if viewed with what my lawyer has called in a private talk we have had impartial sympathy. So let us get started. I have a difficult job before me. So today, Brad and I have talked about addressing the issue of unreliable narration and unreliable narrators with Lolita in particular and in fiction more generally. And so, Brad, what do you know about unreliable narrators and kind of how do you understand that term?
Probably in a fairly basic manner. I think of it as a narrator that I either cannot trust to be telling me the truth because he or she's actively deceiving me, or because they don't actually fully understand what's going on for one reason or another.
Right. I I found that in when I was doing my master's program, unreliable narration and unreliable narrator was thrown around a good deal. And I just assumed, and the way my professors used it was like anything a narrator does you don't like, basically, or
Right.
anything a narrator does you find morally questionable or offensive. And I
Right.
was like, oh,
Well, and
okay,
and and Humbert is certainly that, right?
he's
Whether or not
certainly
that's
that.
unreliable, but he's definitely
He's
that.
certainly all those things, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I got really curious about narratology stuff, and I went back to the book where the term unreliable narrator is created. Wayne C. Booth wrote a really influential study of fiction that's just fantastic for anyone interested in fiction and for fiction writers. It's called The Rhetoric of Fiction. And in that book, he creates this term unreliable narration to refer to a very specific kind of phenomenon. Now, people took that term and they just took it to mean whatever they wanted to. And so I've heard every narrator now called unreliable. So I'd like to take us back to Wayne C. Booth's definition. So
Okay, cool.
here's Booth from The Rhetoric of Fiction. An unreliable narrator is not simply a narrator who does not tell the truth. What fictional narrator ever tells the literal truth? Rather, an unreliable narrator is one who tells lies, conceals information, misjudges with respect to the narrative audience. That is, one whose statements are untrue not by the standards of the real world or of the authorial audience, but by the standards of his own narrative audience. In other words, all fictional narrators are false in that they are imitations, but some are imitations who tell the truth, some of people who lie.
Hmm.
Another distinction that Booth will go on to make is that an unreliable narrator is a narrator whose core values differ from those of the implied author. And just for the ease, because this can get a little complicated for folks. For the ease of our listeners who are interested, I'm going to upload both to YouTube and to Substack a diagram of what I'm about to kind of draw out. So imagine that you have in the center of a page a drawing, and I'll put this up for people to see. And in the center, you have a box with narrative, right? So this is the story that we're getting. To the left of that box, another box where you have narrator. The narrator is the entity that's telling the story. Um, we're going to just deal for the purposes of this conversation with first person narrators as opposed to third limited or third omniscient or third objective.
Mm.
Now, so you have narrator to the right of that narrative, and then to the right of narrative, you have narratee, narratee.
Mhm.
So the narrator is in direct conversation with the narratee. One of the interesting things about Lolita, to tie this to this particular example, is that Humbert is constantly referencing an unseen audience. You know, he says, ladies and gentlemen of the
Right.
jury, and all that sort of stuff, right? So he's writing in this particular instance to an audience of his imagined peers who stand in judgment of him. So
Right.
the narrator narratee relationship is uh, quite well defined. It is because Nabokov defined it that way. Now, we all think of narrators as determining the shape and content of a story, but the narratee determines the shape and content of the story just as much. Here's what I mean by that. Say that I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I've got a hypothetical fictional buddy out here named Jim. And Jim and I go to this beer bar here on the outskirts of Charlotte called the Flying Saucer. And Brad moves into town from Michigan. And he's new to the area. And I'm friends with both Brad and I'm friends with Jim. Now, I have decided, wouldn't it be a good idea to introduce Brad and Jim? Because Brad doesn't know many people yet. I want to get him involved. And we could meet over at the Flying Saucer. So I, as narrator, call up Jim and I say, "Hey, I got a buddy named Brad just moved in. I think you guys would hit it off. You know, Brad would like to meet some people in the area, et cetera, et cetera." He's like, "Oh, that sounds good." I said, "How about we meet at the Saucer, 7 p.m.?" He's like, "Oh, great. I'll grab us a table." Now, that's what my narrative, that particular message looks like in the context of me as narrator calling Jim. However, when I
Mm.
call Brad, Brad's a different kind of narratee. He doesn't have the knowledge of the area. He doesn't know what the flying saucer is. He doesn't know where it is. So then I call
He
up
doesn't
Brad.
know who Jim doesn't know who Jim
Doesn't know,
is either.
doesn't know who Jim is.
Yeah.
So I call up Brad and I'm like, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing Friday night?" "Oh, I don't think we have anything going on." I'm like, "Hey, I got a friend named Jim I want to introduce you to. There's this like kind of hippie beer bar here on North Tryon called the Flying Saucer. It's just off the road from the right." And so
Yeah.
immediately, as narratee, Brad's level of knowledge about, in this particular instance, the area shapes the way I am narrating,
Right.
right? So
Right.
there,
Sure.
if we take it back to Lolita for a second, and this is all going to be in the context of unreliable narrators and unreliable narration. Um, there are certain kinds of things that Humbert explains to us because he assumes that the narratee, the audience for his particular story, his particular narrative, um, doesn't have certain details about his background, doesn't have certain details about where he came from, doesn't have certain details about who he really is, apart from whatever newspaper stories have been written about the Lolita event, which we find out in the foreword to the book written by the fictional doctor, has caused a kind of like stir in the headlines, right? And
Mhm.
so Humbert is filling us in. Everything that Humbert chooses to say says something about the narratee. everything that he doesn't choose to say also says something about the narrative. He feels no need to explain. This is a silly example, but it gets at it. He feels no need to explain what a car is,
Right. Yeah.
right? So with any narrative, you can look that, particularly with a first person narrator, you can look at what a narrator says and what he doesn't say and begin to construct a zero level narrative. Oh,
Mhm.
this narrative is someone who clearly speaks English. This narrative is someone who's familiar with North America. This narrative is someone who's from the same time period as the narrator, et
Right.
cetera, right? And it
Right.
gets, those are general, but you can get more and more and more specific and begin to construct Humbert's audience, who Humbert is speaking to, which is the narrative, not the reader.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm just thinking in sort of the opposite. Like I can now imagine some other kind some other kind of approach where you make no assumptions about what the narratee knows, right? And you basically can't even write that because
Right.
you have to tell them about everything, right? Yeah,
That's
you
right.
introduce the car and you're like, well, the car is a, you know, so
No, it
there's
would be,
some perverse version out there where like it's impossible to tell that person this story basically
well, I
because they
mean,
don't,
yeah, Beckett,
yeah.
that's a great point. Beckett plays with a version of
Right.
that in his novel What, where he begins to, I mean, it's a third person, but it also begins to like there are pages of like pages. He turned left and walked up one step and then went back down step, turned right and went up the step and walked back down the I mean, it's like insane, right? He's
Right.
doing a particular thing. And there are others, you know, Malloy, because he himself is unreliable and compromised in various ways, he will begin to sort of play with the idea of who he's speaking to. Um, the narrator and narratee could, in a particular kind of story, be the same person in the sense that some narrators seem to be speaking to themselves or some part of themselves and recounting things. Some narrators are speaking to someone who's in the room, and that's a narrative gimmick. In Albert Camus' The Fall, which is
Mhm.
actually, I believe, second person, um, it starts off with the kind of devices of like, oh, how are you today? Well, would you like another glass of water? Maybe I could get you some more wine. Oh, you're not drinking, right? So we realize we're getting the narration, we're getting one half of the narration, and we're not getting what the narratee says back, but the narratee is a dramatized character in the story itself, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera.
And as the reader, we're sort of slipping into the place of that dramatized narrative.
Now, here's where things a little more complicated, but this is where unreliable narration begins to come in. So what I've the graph that I've described, the chart where you have narrator, narrative in the middle, narratee on the far side. That's all within the story. That's all within the
Mhm.
pages of the book we're reading,
Mhm.
right? So there's not a kind of outside context, not even the covers of that book. So imagine you got a copy of Lolita. It didn't have Nabokov's name on it. You just got this you got this novel without any context. You'd never heard of Nabokov. You didn't even know what the title was. You know,
Mhm.
pretend there's not a running head at the top of every
Mhm.
page, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Outside on the to the left of narrator is what Booth calls the implied author. And then to
Mhm.
the left of implied author is what he calls author.
Right.
Now, implied author, by that he means this. Implied author is a rhetorical stance that any writer constructs or creates when he is going to tell a fictional story.
Mhm.
So if you, so narrator, narrative, and narratee are all within the pages of the book. If you flip to, if you, you know, close the book and look at the back cover or uh, at the jacket, there's a picture of Nabokov staring at you, right? And that is marketing, and it's also gets at this idea of an implied author. The implied author is wise. The implied author is smart. the implied author has taken care to craft the story, etc., 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 etc. We assume some level of benevolence generally about the implied author, right? And so the
Mhm.
implied author is this kind of stance, and you can see his imprint in the story by what he allows the narrator to say,
Right. Yes, that makes sense.
right? So the passage I started off reading, I want my learned readers to participate in the scene I am about to replay. I want them to examine its every detail and see for themselves how careful, how chaste, the whole wine sweet event is if viewed with what my lawyer has called, in a private talk we have had, impartial sympathy. So let us get started. I have a difficult job before me. Right. Nabokov positions that entire paragraph. And what's going to follow is the first instance where Humbert, with Lolita in the room, sexually gratifies himself,
Hmm.
right? Nabokov allows the narrator to lead in with this irony drenched thing. So it's as if, as Humbert is writing those words, Nabokov is holding up a pair of like rabbit ears behind his head.
Mm, right,
Because
right.
we understand that the position of the implied author is not that Humbert is careful, chaste, that the whole event is wine sweet, that there can be impartial sympathy. So there's a kind of dramatic irony in how those terms come to us. Now, I'm going to expand this and then try to make this a bit more concrete for people because I know if you're listening to this, I can imagine you're not viewing it. You might have trouble keeping these terms distinct and separate. You might have a little difficulty remembering what is this and what is that. So I'll do a little bit of repeating. So you have narrative in the middle. Now we're going to the left side. Narrator, left of the narrator, the implied author. This is this rhetorical stance. And then outside of that, finally, at the far left, the author, the actual human being who writes and farts in stairwells and sometimes has forgotten what he's written on any particular day. If
Right.
you look at the interviews with William Faulkner when he was at UVA, they would ask him questions about As I Lay Dying, and he would get Addie Bundren confused with Joanna Burden of Light in August, right?
Sure.
So the actual author, the living, breathing flesh and blood person, is as unknowable to the actual reader, right, as the
Hmm.
actual reader is to the actual author, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Provided, I'm talking, of course, without the benefit of a YouTube video or
Right.
a biography. So we're saying just from the book itself, what you
Yeah,
see,
there's right. You could read Lolita, like let's say you picked up Lolita, and even though you knew the name Nabokov, somebody could tell you the next day, hey, that's not really his name and that's not what he actually looks like. And
right?
they'd be like, oh, okay.
That's exactly
Apparently
right.
he's some other guy now. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and Nabokov, the actual person, not the stance of Nabokov, as implied author, he imagined as he wrote the kind of audience that he was going to that would read the novel Lolita. Now,
Hmm.
he could not have imagined that two old boys on a podcast in 2025 would be discussing these very things. Podcasts didn't exist. He didn't know
Right.
me. He didn't know Brad, right? So we, as physical, real people, are as unknown to him as the actual Nabokov is to us, right? So let's go to the right of narrative real quick, and I'm going to try to tie all this together. Just
Cool.
bear with me if you're out there listening, you're not quite getting. I'm going to circle around, as they
No, this
say.
is this is good stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so narrative in the middle, to the right, narratee, that's still like in the context of the story, the person who or audience who is listening to the narrator. Then to the right of narratee, the implied author. So the implied author is the idea of audience, right?
Mm.
So when the implied, I'm sorry, implied reader, not
Ah,
implied author.
okay.
I'm sorry, I messed that up. So right,
That
you
was a
have
very unreliable narrator
if,
move of you, Aaron.
absolutely narrative to the right, narratee to the right, implied reader. Um, the implied reader is the entity to which the implied author is constructing this and marketing this tale that we're
Mm.
about to get, right? So
Mhm.
the idea of a reader, the idea of an audience, not the actual flesh and blood Brad and Aaron Gwynn,
Right.
but we can say, oh, clearly the implied author is constructing this tale for a reader who is literate,
Right.
who is interested in literary novels, who is patient enough to play the games Nabokov is playing, all these sorts of things. Just the idea that the implied author has of audience when he sits down to work on the page. Because you're always imagining, as you sit down to write, you're imagining someone on the other side of that, not the actual flesh and blood person, but the
Right.
kind of person who would be interested in the novel you're writing, the story you're
Right.
telling, right? So that's the implied reader. And then to the right of implied reader, you have the actual physical reader, the real person who is, of course, unknowable to the author. Now,
Hmm.
here's where unreliability comes in. And this is to like the narrative and then to the left of this chart, which again, I'll
Writer,
post.
author. Yep.
So, unreliability mostly is a measurement of distance. It measures the distance between the values, mores, most deeply held beliefs of the narrator and those of the implied author,
Mm.
right?
Okay, wait. Say that again for me. I'm
Right,
sorry. Say that
right.
again.
Yeah. So, unreliability is the measurement of distance between the narrator, the person telling the story,
Hmm.
and those of the implied author,
Hmm.
the benevolent rhetorical stance that Nabokov is adopting when he shapes this story, when he holds those rabbit ears behind Humbert's head, etc., etc., etc.
A-
And
And
yes,
so the greater that distance,
the
uh,
more
the
unreliable.
more unreliable. Okay,
Exactly.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
Now, narrators can be unreliable in all different kinds of ways. We generally think of unreliability as being a negative quality, as being evidence of deception or,
Hmm.
moral, as they say in the documents of the university where I teach, moral turpitude, uh,
Right.
all that kind of stuff, right? We think of it as a liability.
Hmm.
However, unreliability can actually be a strength. Let me give you a quick example, and I think this will, you know, draw the room together, as Lebowski says about the rug. So let's take a novel called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which most people will be familiar with. Huck Finn is an unreliable narrator, but he's unreliable in a very particular kind of way. So if we put the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn on our chart. In the center, we have the narrative, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. To the left, the narrator is Huck Finn. Now, particularly interesting here, to the left of narrator, we have the implied author, who is Mark Twain.
Hmm. Who is kind of a character create, right? I mean,
Absolutely a character,
yeah.
right? So
Hmm.
in this particular instance, I mean, writers adopt pen names because they sense deep down this whole thing about the implied author is a rhetorical stance,
Yes.
right? And the Mark Twain created by the actual author, Sam Clemens,
Mhm.
is not the same person as Sam Clemens,
Right.
right? This
Right.
is a like you said, this is a character. I
Hmm.
mean, I think it's the implied author is probably it's better to think of that, you know, that stance, that rhetorical position as a kind of character. And,
Yeah, I think a clear way to see it for me is when going over to sort of the music side of things, a musician who takes a stage name, it would be
exactly.
sort of the implied author, right? And they've got a
Yep.
crazy costume and all of that, but and they go
Absolutely.
home, they wear a collared shirt, and
Yep.
their wife says, "Hey, Carl," or whatever.
Persona.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
this kind of character, or rhetorical stance, or what you want to call it, is created pretty much in all the arts. Whether the
hmm
person is a writer, whether a singer, a performer, some kind of magician,
hmm
actors, right? Often have
yeah,
like their stage name. I mean, the implied author. There it is. The implied author is the stage name,
right, right. I
right?
like it.
And
Yeah.
that's who the kind of like audience is interacting with. And that's why you have all of these biographies that will come out and say, no, 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 no. The real Johnny Carson was not the guy on the Tonight Show. The real Johnny Carson, I mean,
Yeah.
because Johnny Carson, the dude on the talk show, for those of you that remember Johnny Carson, that was a performance. That was
hmm
an act, right? Okay.
hmm
Now, in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck Finn, that story starts with Huck Finn saying, which is particularly interesting to me just from the standpoint of narrative theory, you don't know about me unless you've read a book called The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain, which is an interesting thing for a fictional character to start off saying. You don't
Right.
know
I
about me.
exist in this other book. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
mean, you could just go off on that forever. But
hmm
then he goes, he basically says, it's a pretty good book, even if he told some real stretchers, right? Some tall tales or lies. So the
Yeah.
narrator, Huck Finn, announces himself as someone that we might not know, but if we do know, we know from this novel from Mark Twain, and our knowledge about that, about Huck based on that novel is compromised because Mark Twain told some real stretchers. Okay, now that in and of itself does not make Huck Finn unreliable, but it's Twain is signaling in some ways the type of game that he's going to play throughout the novel. Now, the climax, and spoiler alert, I'm sorry to spoil this 150-year-old novel for you guys.
Right.
If you haven't read it, then like I don't know what to tell you, no shade, but like just don't be
Yeah.
upset.
You should though. It's a great book.
It's
Yeah.
a great book.
Yeah.
Like Hemingway said that all American literature comes from a book called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I don't agree with that, but I think it's an interesting idea and the kind of provocative thing Hemingway liked to say. Now,
Yeah.
the climax of this book, for those of you that don't know, Huck is this rural boy and he doesn't want to be schooled and he doesn't want to be tamed, and other things are happening, and so he gets on a raft and goes down the Mississippi, and it's set in the antebellum South, pre-Civil War slavery South, right? And on his journey, he meets up with a man named Jim, and Jim is an escaped slave. He's run away,
hmm
and Jim and Huck have adventures together and travels together, and they begin to form a relationship, a friendship. Um, but then there's a climactic moment where the slave catchers are after Jim, and they're going to take him back into slavery and all this kind of stuff, and Huck has to make a choice. And he believes, because of how he's been raised in this rural community, that if he helps an enslaved man escape slavery, he'll go to hell,
mm
right?
hmm
He's been taught to believe that slavery is not only legal, but it is moral and righteous, right? So he has this choice to make, right? And there's a famous moment where he says, it's basically, if I help this man, I'll be damned, I'll be doomed. And then he says, well, then I'll go to hell, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he chooses to help Jim. Now, at that particular moment, Twain holds rabbit ears up behind Huck Finn because the reader, we know that Huck Finn, because of the way he's raised, because of the way he's been educated, because of the time and place he comes from, he has a set of values and mores that are completely backwards.
Mm-hmm.
We understand as readers in that moment, Huck's not going to hell. Huck is doing the righteous thing. He's helping this man escape bondage. Like this is the right thing. And it's the society that he grows up in that is twisted and false and damned.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly because the novel was written after the Civil War, we know what all of that would lead to, the consequences for all that, particularly for the South, right?
Right.
So that's a very famous moment and a moment of unreliability because the Mark Twain, who constructs that scene in such a way with its particular kind of irony, shows us a boy who's been so brainwashed by the slave South that he thinks he's going to be damned for doing something that's righteous. We don't
Mm-hmm.
for a minute think that Mark Twain believes that Huck is going to hell or that Huck is doing
Right.
anything wrong. Quite the opposite. And that is an instance of unreliability where unreliability actually says something positive about the character, positive about the narrator, right? And Huck doesn't fully see himself or the situation. He's,
Right.
after all, quite young and
Right.
inexperienced, right? So I think it's good to take it back to Huck Finn, which is one of the first unreliable narrators in American literature, at least. Um,
I
where, yeah,
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's also, I mean, just thinking about, using this concept of unreliable narrator as a writer, I think it's a really good example too of showing how you can sort of express some things sort of thematically or morally, but not wind up in this sort of preachy position, right? You sort of assemble this
absolutely.
circumstance that's separate from the implied author a little bit, anyway. Um, and it gets into sort of the realm of thought experiment a little bit and then kind of plays out rather than Mark Twain stepping in and saying, now, slavery was wrong, right? Like, because that's the correct thing to say, but it's not very interesting to read, of course, right? But we want to see this thing sort of play out. And Mark Twain creating that distance allows us to kind of not only see it, but sort of see a degree of irony in it, right? That in order to sort of break through this brainwashing, you actually somebody at some point has to be willing to pay the price for doing the right thing, right? It adds thematic layers and richness to it that I think
Yes,
wouldn't come without that distance.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, a scholar named Paul Rabinowitz took, uh, or sorry, Peter Rabinowitz took some exception to Booth's definition, even though he creates terms. His focus was on the status of the fictional discourse in a novel. Um, and he sort of recasts the chart, Booth's chart that I just laid out, in his own terms. And his terms are four: actual audience, which is the flesh and blood people who read the book;
Mhm.
two, authorial audience, the hypothetical audience to whom the author addresses his text. So that would be the implied reader in Booth terms.
Wait,
Um,
so but
yeah.
would that be I'm just trying to keep my things straight. So
Hmm.
would that wouldn't be the narratee?
No, that's actually the reader. That's
Okay,
actually
okay.
yeah, yeah. The narrative audience,
Oh,
the
okay.
imitation audience, which also possesses particular knowledge. So that would be, in Bloom's terms, the narratee, the quote
Okay.
narrative audience. And then he goes on, the ideal narrative audience, uncritical audience who accepts what the narrator is saying. I don't find that last term particularly helpful. But
Yeah, that seems like it's kind of overcomplicating it, though.
I
Maybe I could
mean,
be,
welcome to
maybe
literary
there's,
criticism.
right, right. Maybe there is an example of a text in which it's like you actually do need that distinction, but at the face of it, it seems a little too complicated. But
Yeah, for those for the listeners, well, here's what I would encourage all of you guys to do. Um, Take a look at the rhetoric of fiction, read the books that argue with it. If this conversation really ignites something with you, I went down the narratology rabbit hole in graduate school, and just, you know, cards on the table. I was very frustrated when I was doing my master's. I did a lit master's, and then I did a creative PhD, University of Denver. But I did a straight up lit master's, and I was reading all this literary criticism and all this literary theory, and I was reading Foucault and Baudrillard, and some of those people are interesting, and sometimes some of what they say is interesting, other things aren't. But we'd be asked every semester in every seminar I took to write one or two papers in which we took some literary theory or some piece or pieces of literary criticism and applied them to some poor unsuspecting story, poem, or play. and and
right.
I began to just be really frustrated with that, because at first I entered it thinking everyone was acting in good faith, and then you have to do all this quote research to write your term paper, and you read these essays and books that critics have written about Joyce or Hemingway or Faulkner or Pound or Woolf or whomever, and you're like, okay, like a lot of this is really ridiculous.
Right.
Like, that fourth term is a little goofy to me and Brad, but
Yeah.
it gets so absurd. and
Right.
and then there's only so much you can say to a certain degree about a particular author before you either begin repeating what others have said, or worse, by the 1980s, critics, quote, literary critics, are just trying to um, justify the wildest kind of theories about a text. And arguments of Moby Dick as a feminist
Right.
parable. And it's like,
Right.
okay, like, you should believe whatever you want, you should write whenever you want, but whatever Moby Dick is, it's not a feminist parable,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
there's plenty of ambiguity within Moby Dick, and plenty of things to, like, people cannot see eye to eye, but words matter, and meaning matters, and stories matter. Um, and so anyway, I got very frustrated with how far it just keeps getting more and more and more and more ridiculous the farther you go. And so
Yeah.
I was like, is there any criticism out there that was written after 1970 that is actually interesting? And there is. Peter
Sure.
Brooks' Reading for the Plot is a book I would recommend. It's a fantastic book of criticism post 1970. And so I started reading narratology stuff, uh, and really connected with it, narrative theory stuff, and found it like very grounded in like, no, we are just trying to understand how these narratives operate and create a vocabulary to talk about this stuff. Not all the narratology stuff is good, not all the narratology stuff is helpful, but Booth is the kind of, for an American audience, um, he is one of the first narratologists who breaks things down in a really straightforward and, for me, helpful way. It informed the way I read, it informed the way I wrote,
Mm.
to a certain degree, to a certain
Right.
degree. I think both Brad and I don't want to speak for Brad actually, but
Yeah.
yeah, I wouldn't encourage fiction writers to approach their work with the same kind of, like, scientific or pseudo-scientific kind of frame, and to really let themselves be open to whatever inspiration or the muse or whatever it happens to be, whatever mystical kind of experience the writer has. Anyway, I've talked a whole lot, Brad, and you've been so kind to
No,
listen to me.
this is interesting, and I think people will, listeners will find it interesting too. You know, the your comments on sort of the tendencies of academic writing really ring true for me, and it makes me think. And you know, I don't read as much theory and criticism as I once did, and you can find great stuff, but it does
Yep,
strike me that there is in general, just sort of speaking in generalities, there's a kind of uh I've come to really think a lot about the concept of an arms race and how it applies
yep,
to different things. And I think there's something like that in academia where it's like everybody's trying to say something nobody else said before,
that's it.
right? And at some point, that's cool. That's cool as a
It's fine.
tendency.
It's
But
fine.
at some point, you get out to the point where the reason no one said this any before is because it's pointless.
Okay,
Right?
so yeah, there
Like you
you're
see this on social media too, because it's a takes
100%.
race on there. And
It's a
eventually,
takes
sometimes,
race.
yeah, people get themselves either saying something just for the novelty and the provocation. You're like, that doesn't actually make any sense.
You're absolutely right. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. Furthermore, like on a lot of issues, uh, I hear people argue about all kinds of things, or
Mhm.
see people arguing about all kinds of things on the internet. Fine, whatever. And I, am open to being persuaded or gaslit or whatever about
Right.
particular things, given how much time I want to devote to it. On this particular issue, what we're talking about right now, like I unfortunately, as someone who has been in English departments nonstop since 1994 as a student or as a graduate teaching assistant or as a lecturer or as a professor. I've been a professor at University of North Carolina, Charlotte since the summer of 2003. I was hired out of grad school, blah, 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 blah. So I know how all of this works. I can't be gaslit to make, no one can make me believe something that's not true. Here's the whole
Right.
thing. Like in the 1970s, English departments needed a way to a criteria by which to promote other professors. They needed something, right? And this
Mhm.
happened, of course, throughout the humanities, but dealing with English departments here. So the focus really shifted away from teaching, which by the way, I happen to think should be the thing that professors are judged by, literature professors rather. I think it's different for creative writers. And so they just decided, okay, the way we're going to judge professors' performance for promotion and everything else is the publish or perish model. Do you have a book? Do you have this or that? Now,
And-
I think it is great if a professor, you know, decides that he or she's really passionate about Joyce and wants to write a book about Joyce or Ulysses or whatever happens to be. Um, it's great if they have something insightful to say, but forcing professors to publish about the literature and the field they work, forcing them, like if you don't do this, you won't get tenure, has
Right.
created libraries full of terrible criticism and
Oh yeah.
impenetrable, uh, horrible prose.
Mhm. Well, there seems to be in some cases an adoption of a kind of jargon that consciously or not seems to serve as kind of a gatekeeping function. It's like you don't quite understand. I'm going to use jargon. And you, as the reader, aren't going to really understand this until I sort of allow you to, right?
Right,
There isn't an
right.
effort to like, I'm going to try to, like, I think we're trying to do in this episode is like try to get this concept across in a way that actually makes sense and that you might be
Absolutely.
able to use as a reader or a writer. Instead, there's this sort of like trying to present yourself as a the expert in this subtopic, and you're only really going to be able to peel back the layers once you understand my idiosyncratic definition of about 15 to 20 technical terms.
Yes, and the prose itself
Yeah.
is impenetrable
Yes.
impenetrable and tortured
Yeah.
because there is so little room. Everything's been said about Hamlet.
Hmm.
Maybe something new will be said. Maybe, maybe someone will come with a new take. I'm not going to rule that, but pretty much
Yeah.
everything's been said about Hamlet, and had been by the 1930s
Right.
at the
Right.
very least, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so what begins to happen is like literary critics see that there's so little, as you said, there's so little space for someone to say something new, and it has to be new,
Hmm.
right? To qualify as scholarship. Um,
Well, does this lead to, I mean, I know we're getting kind of a field of Lolita, but I think this is actually interesting. Like, does this lead to, let me back up for a second. So I think a lot about, as a writer, I pay a lot of attention to how people just interact sort of
mhm.
unconsciously, just like what do they automatically do? And a lot of people, when there's nothing else to talk about, we tend to, as humans, fall into complaint. I do this too. Everybody does
Yep,
this because there's something human nature about this. You meet up with somebody,
absolutely.
let's complain. We're going to both kind of complain, and there's cathartic reasons for this, and etc. But I kind of wonder too if there's a tendency in academia. It's like we're running out of stuff to say, so let's just start picking everything apart. Let's just start picking all the scabs, pulling out all the
Yep.
threads, and sort of kvetching about this thing, right?
Yes,
That guy's a racist, this person's a sexist, this person's a, whatever.
that's right.
Because there's nothing else to say in a way. It's all been said already.
And it's the easiest thing to do is to
It
find
is.
fault.
Oh, for sure.
Most of the kind of confrontational stuff I
Hmm.
see on Twitter, X,
Hmm.
whatever, and
Hmm.
on any social media platform, I'm just talking about the stuff that's actually confrontational,
Hmm.
is that like we're going to find fault with these things and we're going to find faults that no one else has found.
Right. Right.
We're going to tell you why um, Stevie Ray Vaughan was actually racist for playing the
Right.
blues.
Right.
No
Right.
one ever thought Stevie Ray Vaughan was racist, and Stevie Ray Vaughan wasn't racist. But can we figure out a way that
Right.
playing the blues is actually racist for Stevie Ray
Right.
Vaughan, right?
Right.
And it's the easiest thing to do.
Well, and we see this in Lolita. I mean, you'll see comments anytime the book Lolita crops up, you'll
Yep.
see a comment or two about this book like legitimizes pedos, right? And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's like okay, that might be a starting point for an observation, but I'm gonna want like two or three more sentences at least for you to
100%.
convey why it does that. Because to me, it doesn't. So
I think
I'm gonna
it
need
does the opposite.
in my opinion, it does. So I'm going to need a little bit more something, a little bit more cogitation on there to explain to me how it does that, because to me
Well
it
said.
doesn't. And so, yeah, because you're right. The easiest thing to say is like, that book is garbage because it does this. Well, does it, does it really? Does it empirically? Can you make an argument for it actually doing it? Like, there's a thing where it's sort of like this is getting into kind of my thinking about criticism in general. I
Right.
know criticism serves an important function, and I know honest
Hmm.
criticism and thoughtful criticism is great, but there is a way in which I tend to not publicly criticize any. If I don't like something, I just don't talk about it usually in terms of literature. And the reason
I
that I
admire
do
that.
that is because if something's not good, there will be enough people to talk negatively about it. I don't necessarily need to
That's right.
contribute my voice. Now, it doesn't mean I'm gonna lie about it and say I like stuff I don't. I just won't talk about it. But mostly because that the reason for that is I would like the sort of literary space to just be more generally sort of positive and enthusiastic and interesting, right?
Yes.
There's a million books. 950,000 of them are garbage. So
Yep.
let's just, that's kind of my attitude. Let's talk about the
Well,
50,000 that we like. But
my my favorite critic, I think you can call him a critic, cultural critic.
yeah.
He does all kinds of stuff. At the moment, since Janet Malcolm left us, is Adam
Hmm.
Gopnik. Now,
Okay.
I'm not down with everything Gopnik says. I don't agree with all of his opinions, but
Sure.
he always writes really thoughtful, interesting. essays, and particularly like he's turned the review essay where instead of reviewing just like, one book, he'll review like 10 on a particular topic.
That's cool. Yeah.
Um, he has an essay that's one of the most uh, interesting and like for me as a Christian, harrowing
Hmm.
about the Jesus book industry. And there
Mm.
were all these books in this particular essay. I think this is back in 2016, around anyway. He talks about, the books just published that year about Jesus, historical stuff. And he ends up like composing this really interesting argument about Christianity and critique of it that made me, as a Christian, it made me squirm, right?
Mm.
Like, so I thought it was really insightful, and I like that kind of writing.
Mhm.
And I've read a number of his pieces over the years that I thought were really, really sharp, even when I disagreed or disliked some of their conclusions. Um,
Is this the article, and you might not remember the title, but is this like fairly recent this year from the New Yorker? We're still not done with Jesus.
no, I haven't read that one. I want to read it.
Oh,
This
okay.
is yeah, this was probably 10 years ago
Oh,
or
okay.
so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to read that because I love the book Jose Saramago's The Gospel According to Jesus
It's a
Christ, and
very
I know
interesting
it's
book. I've
I
read
know
that
it's
too.
here. I know it's heretical, but I love it, and I'm always
It's
interested in
interesting.
other takes on it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, Something that else I appreciate about Gopnik, and this goes back to our earlier point about so much of this academic prose about literature is unreadable. Here's the thing: the more complicated, if you're writing nonfiction, if you're writing criticism essays, the more complicated your point is, the more complicated the ideas, the simpler and clearer and cleaner the prose should be,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
right? If you're dealing with really, really complicated concepts and ideas that are hard to grasp, I mean, I don't know that I did a good job trying to, do the narratology stuff at the beginning of this,
No, it
but
made good sense to me. Yeah.
I really wanted to try to make that as clear as possible. I suppose I could have gotten on and been like, well, you have the, implied author and the implied reader, they're in conversation, and said all that in a really baroque, like
Yeah.
purposefully baroque way. But
Right.
yeah, the opposite ought to be true. The more complicated the concept, if you're trying to actually communicate to people, the onus is on you as a writer to actually communicate.
Yeah, now let me just kind of throw this up and see what you think of it. I mean, is that because I agree with that, but I'm starting to think, okay, why do I agree with that? And is this because, you and I both write fiction that we tend to think, see, I tend to think, I guess, that part of the role of the fiction writer and even maybe the poet as well, and other and screenwriter, etc., is to sort of convey complicated things in a simple way, but also complicate what is sort of assumed and seems simple a little bit, right? Like presenting moral situations and presenting them as perhaps being more complicated than they may
Right.
seem, but also taking other things and sort of stripping them down to their
Mm-hmm.
basics to sort of
Mm-hmm.
show them what they are. And I think if that is somewhat of your perspective, when you sort of wade into academic papers, and as I prepared this madness portion, we're going to talk more
Mm-hmm.
about Lolita. I'm digging into a few academic papers. I don't try
Mm-hmm.
to lean too heavily on them, but I like to see what's been written. I don't want to just say something somebody else has already said
Yeah,
better
yeah.
than me, right? But you go into that, and there is an element of just like, yeah, why are you making this so hard? Why are you making
100%.
this
It
fairly
doesn't,
simple, straightforward thing more complicated? It's not
it,
adding anything.
yeah, it not only doesn't need to be, it oughtn't be. If the
Right.
concepts you're dealing with are, as I said, difficult, you should be
Hmm.
like streamlining and making them communicable to, you
That
know,
would be the point of writing about it, I would think.
that would be the
Kind
point of
of.
writing about it. Yeah, absolutely. To
Yeah.
explicate a particularly hard work. No, and I
Right.
completely agree with you about literature. As fiction writers, if you tap into the characters and explore them as fully realized people in hard, difficult, traumatic situations, I mean, you're going to get to this point of, complication and, two different worldviews colliding among characters, multiple different worldviews colliding, and you're going to see things from all these different perspectives. And that's where literature lives in
Mm-hmm.
that place of unfolding. Whereas criticism ought to be like, I want to talk about this particular thing. I want to show you something. Okay, here's what literary criticism should do. It should do three things. One, it should say something useful about the text. Two, it should show how smart you are as a critic. Three,
Right.
it should give you an opportunity to make fun of other critics. That's what
Yeah,
literary
for sure.
criticism should do. Like great criticism,
Right.
that's what it does.
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. That's very interesting. I like that quite a bit. I mean, certainly, yeah, I think all three of those things definitely hit. I mean, there's also sort of, I mean, do you make a distinction between something like that like Adam Gopnik is writing the, and I may have incidentally read a
Mhm.
Gopnik piece or two, but nothing comes to mind that I have. Do you make a distinction between something like that and a sort of review that's more like, I just want to find out if I want to read this book or not, and
Yeah,
so I want to read this
yeah, yeah.
review. Yeah.
No, two of my favorite critics. I think Owen Gleiberman writes for Variety now.
Okay.
I've enjoyed a number of his film reviews over the years. My absolute favorite movie critic, I don't think she, I don't know if she still works anymore. I don't know if she's still with us. It was a woman named Lisa Schwartzbaum who wrote for
Hmm.
Entertainment Weekly. And she was her reviews, man, were so sharp and so insightful. And if the movie was good, they made you want to see that movie. If you'd
Right,
already
right,
seen the movie, like I would go check what has Lisa Schwartzbaum said about Cinderella Man, whatever it happened to be. And
right.
like it was illuminating. I mean,
That's
in
what
the
you want.
literals,
Yeah,
yeah, it
yeah.
shed light on the thing, and the best quality any kind of critic can have, her passion for, in her case, film. Like you felt it. You got fired up. And that, I mean, a great critic should get you fired up about, great works of art. Now, also the critic can like point out why something fails, and
Hmm.
that can be quite interesting, though I don't as much enjoy those kinds of reviews. I think they're necessary,
Hmm.
but I'm not as interested in that because there are tons of bad books. Let's celebrate the
Right.
ones that are good. Brandon Taylor wrote a review of Rachel Kushner's latest novel for, um, I believe, the Times Literary, no, the London Review of Books.
Okay.
And it was last fall, I got on Twitter and I just saw a lot of people I follow talking about it and being like, oh, snap, you just,
Hmm.
you really showed her what's what. And I'm like,
Right.
okay. And by the way, I haven't read a lot of Kushner. I tried the flamethrowers. I
I
might have been
like
in,
the I like the flamethrowers quite a lot. It's the only thing I've read by her though,
yeah,
so I don't,
I
I can't
was,
speak to the newest book.
I might have been in a kind of weird headspace. For whatever reason, I'm not going to blame it on her or the book. I happen not to connect with it.
Mhm.
And I didn't finish it when I attempted it. But again, like, I'm a professor, I'm reading all kinds of stuff. I,
Mhm.
I always like try to give a book that gets that kind of acclaim, second and third tries. And sometimes I realize they're masterpieces.
Mhm.
Um, but I went and read Taylor's review, and seriously, there wasn't one grounded criticism of her
Ugh.
novel. I mean, there wasn't a single like, okay, formally there's this problem, or there's this
Right.
problem with the plot, or this character's decision doesn't make sense given that X, Y, and Z. It was all just vibes based. Who does she think she is? It was just a
And
takedown for no reason.
that's frustrating to me because especially because this world the world of, the world of fiction that Kushner kind of lives in, there's there's not that many careers doing all that great, you know? Like it's a difficult enough world to make a career in for anybody.
That's right.
And something like that can really derail somebody's career. And I'm not saying you should be
Right.
dishonest and just say, no, I thought it was great when you didn't, but like these things do kind of have consequences to a certain degree. And I think you still got to like be fair. Like you said, flamethrowers didn't necessarily work for you. And that was that a grand statement about, this is what this book is? No, it's sort of it just bounced off me for some reason.
I
Somebody else
just
might really like it.
I wasn't in the
Yeah.
headspace for it at the
Sure,
time, and
that's
I'm
fair.
not.
I've read a
Yeah,
bunch of stuff like that where it just bounced
yeah.
off me for whatever reason, and I've had a number of books that I found my way back to on a second attempt later and actually really liked it.
I
So,
my first experience with Robert Stone's Dog Soldiers,
mhm,
like in that particular moment, it didn't hit me right, and it was
mhm.
100% the headspace I was in
Dude,
because
I had the same reaction. And my MFA program, it was recommended to me because I don't know, my advisor saw something and I was doing in Dog Soldiers, and I read it and I was like, what the hell is he talking about? This book sucks. And then later on, I ended up reading A Flag for Sunrise for some reason. I
hmm
don't remember.
hmm
I think it was just at a used bookstore and it was there,
hmm
and I was like, I'm gonna give this a try. And I really liked it. And then I went back
hmm
to Dog Soldiers and was like, oh, this book is freaking brilliant,
It's
actually.
fantastic. No, I think I tried it and I couldn't get out of like the first few chapters, the kind
Yeah,
of Converse Vietnam section. I just didn't hit right with it. And then
sure.
I was talking to Nick Pizzolatto, and this is like 2011 or something. We were chatting about books, and he's like, "You've read Dog Soldiers, right?" And I was like, "I tried." He's like, "Dude," he goes, "You need to like give
Try
that another."
again.
Yeah, he was like, "Give it another shot." And just
Right on.
because of the respect I have for him, I
Mhm.
went back to it and I was like, oh my gosh. And like, I mean, I was on, Facebook at the time. I was on Facebook, quoting it. And then Nick was like, oh, changed your mind about it, have you? I was like, it's fucking awesome, man. I love that book and I've taught the book. It deserves all its
Yeah,
accolades and
absolutely.
more. But yeah, I'm not even willing to say anything negative about the flamethrowers at all.
Right.
I read a few chapters, didn't connect with it, and moved on. I'll try it again. I'm not, yeah, but I thought Taylor's review was quite unfair.
Well, it's much like, I mean, you can see these patterns in other and I don't want to say too, I've never read that review, so I don't know, but you can imagine, put in your mind a sort of hypothetical critic who's in this takes race is trying to get clicks. Well, one way to do it is to fire some shots at a really well-respected author.
Of
And
course,
if you can contextualize it in the sort of culture war games that are going on, even all the better, right?
100%.
And so who knows? And again, I haven't read that particular review, so I can't speak to it directly, but I know this kind of thing happens quite a lot, where
That's right.
it's really easy to make the sort of negative point, and get some attention and flare up some engagement. But I don't know how useful that really is for the most part.
Yeah,
Like I said, my negative reviews are I won't talk about it.
yeah,
So
I saw
that seems like
like,
enough of a negative review for me.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
saw a number of people, celebrating that review, and then I saw I think Maura Donegan and some others like, I mean, they were just straight up calling at least the review a misogynist and
Mm,
some inferences about him. Um,
right.
I I don't know him. I can't judge that. I like having read that review. Like I'm not the guy that's out there leveling charges of misogyny toward people all the time or whatever. It's
Right.
not really my bag.
Right.
But I actually thought about what Moira said, and I'm not saying that Brandon Taylor's misogynist. I don't know him. I'm not saying
Mm,
that review even is misogynist, but I thought about it in the context of what Moira said, and I thought, man, I actually wouldn't say the things that he said in that review for fear that I would be accused of being a misogynist. Like it seemed
right.
like, holy crap, man.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but
Right.
I don't know if
Yeah.
here's the thing: if you get interested in Kushner's new book, read her new novel, and read Brandon Taylor's review and learn to review books and see for yourself about both of
Right.
them.
Right. Right.
Maybe I'm wrong about both things, but
I might do that because like I said, the only thing I've read by her is Flamethrowers, and I liked it.
hmm
I was in the headspace for it for whatever reason, and it really rang a bell for me. So I'd be totally willing to give her new book a
that's
shot. I got
awesome.
a big stack of stuff to read, so I mean, we'll see if I ever get to it, but
Yeah, there's it's
yeah.
never any. So, to kind of wrap things up, for this particular episode, we're coming back, and
Mhm.
I know you have a lot of stuff for our
Yeah, we
madness
got juicy
portion, deep,
stuff.
juicy, deep
Yeah.
dives.
Yeah.
Um, I really, Brad and I were talking a little bit before the show, and I really wanted to hone in on this one particular concept, and I was buttressed in my view when I posted something on Twitter earlier about some unreliable narrators I really enjoyed, and I had listed Huck Finn, and all these people like Huck Finn, what would you call that? And no shade to anyone who replied, but one of the things just in general, the replies I got, not all of them, but the replies I got showed to me or proved is like, well, people just don't know what this term means.
Yeah, no, and I had a fairly relatively simplistic view of it as well. I think it's what you've given us is, I think, a more expansive understanding of sort of technically what's
hmm
happening when you say unreliable narrator. And I think also, it helps us understand a little bit more about why a writer would use an unreliable narrator, right? And I think also, as you're reading a book, especially if it's first person, I think you can sort of find, okay, you can identify, oh, hey, I think I'm in unreliable narrator territory here.
hmm
Uh,
hmm
and because of that, why is the implied author, why is the narrator doing this?
Yes.
Why is the implied author doing this? Right?
Yes.
And maybe actually understand another layer of what's actually going on in the book. So I think
Hopefully.
that's super helpful. And I think you've also helped me kind of get my head around more this idea of what Nabokov's doing in Lolita, why he's established this distance. Um, and of
Right.
course, in the void between, we've got all kinds of interesting things to look at. Also, a lot of
100%.
sort of surface level commentary that we've seen from people on it over the years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I first got on this unreliable narrator beat. The first time I was taking a British literature class in grad school from a professor I really adored. Her name was
Mhm.
Elizabeth Grubgeld, and she taught the novel that is considered to be the kind of um, like gold standard of unreliable narrators. Ford Maddox Ford's The Good
Mm,
Soldier. It's a
mm,
fantastic friggin' book. Just great. 200 pages, first person, uh, a lot of really great stuff. And when she taught it, she was talking about unreliable narration, this, that, and the other. And I, I was first year grad student, master's student at the time. And so I was just trying to understand. I said, well, what, like when you say it's unreliable, he's unreliable, the narrator, John Dowell, like, what are you getting that? And she's like, it's on every page. It's on every page. I was like, okay, yeah, but like, can you show me one?
right,
Like,
right.
and she goes, well, and there's a passage when he's on a train and he looks out the window and there's a cow lying on its back with all of its hooves in the air.
Mm.
And what John Dowell says, it is so what one doesn't expect from a cow, which I thought was funny. It made me laugh. And
That's
she
funny.
goes, I would never think that. I would think that poor animal. And
Mm,
something like I didn't have Booth's definitions, but something like seemed off about that. And so
mm,
when I got to Booth and he was like, doesn't matter what your own opinions about the behavior is, does the implied author, is there a distance between the implied author's attitudes, beliefs about this thing and the narrator's beliefs about this thing? It's not about what the reader has to say, has makes no difference. If we're talking about reliability in terms of narration. Now that you may think the narrator's a jerk, you may think he's
right.
unlikable. That's fine, but that's a separate. That's a
That
separate
is
kind of issue.
no, that is that is a separate question for sure,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think in Lolita, there's not only is Humbert unlikable, I don't know if there's anybody likable in Lolita. Maybe Lolita herself at times, but beyond that, I don't know if
Yeah.
anybody in that book is actually likable that you would,
No, it's
yeah,
yeah, that's really true. You don't like
Dolores,
no, was it
not,
Charlotte?
or sorry, Charlotte. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. You don't like Charlotte
Dolores is
Hayes.
Lolita. Yeah,
It's hard to see um, Lolita herself because she's so
right,
filtered through Humbert. A, a,
right.
a question my students will sometimes ask, and this is a great question. If you have a first person narrator
Mhm.
and the world you're being taken into and the story you're being told is entirely coming from this one first person narrator, how can you begin to talk about reliability at all?
Right,
Because you only
right.
have this one voice. And it's like, well, how do you know when your friend is lying?
Yeah.
Does the narrator contradict himself?
Mhm.
Does the narrator, is the scene constructed in such a way where, the mask slips in some way? And we
Right.
see more than what the narrator would like to show us, which
Mhm.
often happens in Lolita. There's this kind of, I mean, when Humbert will turn from time to time, and there's a moment of just a glance where he's not viewing Lolita as a sexual object, and he sees this crying child,
Mm,
which is
yeah.
always, for me as a reader, it really shakes me out of the spell.
Oh yeah, for sure. For
And
sure.
Nabokov, as you know, I'm talking about the implied author Nabokov, really allows that beat to hit very hard so
Mhm.
that you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. This is very different than what Humbert's been presenting this as.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you bring that up. Those are, I think, the most sort of striking and emotionally kind of resonant moments, but I think there's a lot of smaller instances of doing the same kind of thing. As we were kind of headed towards this recording, I underline a lot of things as I'm reading,
Hmm.
and then, one thing that makes that convenient is I can kind of re-experience the book just by flipping through my underlined sections.
Hmm.
And I'm sort of going through there, and I noticed that there's something that I underlined a few times wherein Humbert presents himself as physically grotesque in some way. Like he talks
Hmm.
about his hairy hand or something like that. I kind of realized that I think there's like a thing that Humbert, the narrator, is doing, which is a sort of a psychological coping or cover up mechanism that you'll
Hmm.
see people do in real life occasionally, where they're sort of like admitting that they are repulsive or bad or evil or something, and
Hmm.
it almost like provides them cover from blame. It's like,
Absolutely.
it's like, yeah, of course I'm friggin' disgusting. Like what else would you expect out of that? And they're sort of like buying themselves some, I don't know if it's credit exactly. They're buying themselves some cover because how are you going to judge me? I just judged myself, sort of.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
also he is presenting himself as grotesque, not for the thing that we're actually concerned about,
Right.
but because of his hands are hairy. I'm like, I'm not
Right.
worried about your
I don't
hairy
care about
hands,
how, yeah,
Humbert. It's what you're doing to this
exactly.
child that's the
Right.
problem.
Right.
That's the problem.
You could have a completely perfect hand and
Yeah,
all of
yeah,
this
yeah,
is
yeah.
still equally
Just
repulsive. Yeah.
just in that passage, like if you read the full passage that we
Hmm.
started this episode off with, um, in order to do what he's doing, pleasure himself while this child is sitting on his lap, he starts singing the lyrics to this pop song, but he can't remember the lyrics, right? So he says, Carmen, my little Carmen, something, something, those something nights, which is
Yeah.
funny. Like that
Hmm.
line, something, something, those something
Right.
nights, because he's forgetting, but also like he's the kind of narrator who can't remember the lyrics to this thing, but can
Right.
remember every other detail. I mean, there's
Right.
some really rich, talk about unreliability, there's some really rich
Yeah.
stuff there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, I think this was a good one, Brad. I
Yeah.
hope some folks
Yeah.
got something from it. I hope I
Well,
wasn't confusing.
I certainly enjoyed it. Folks, we're gonna have a part three to this Lolita conversation. If you stumbled on this first, go back and listen to our conversation with Kat Rosenfield. I think she had a very interesting perspective on this book, and it was just a
Absolutely.
fun conversation to have. But coming up after this, behind the paywall at Substack and Patreon, we're gonna have the madness portion. I've got a bunch of stuff. We're going to talk about Nabokov's curious theories about time, his
Mm,
prophetic, or maybe they were prophetic
mm.
dreams. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of the postmodern canon, and I know Aaron's going to have stuff to say
Interesting.
about that, and how Lolita fits into all that. And I got a couple of other books you people may be familiar with that I want to kind of contrast and compare with. So we're going to have a
Love it.
bunch of stuff to talk about. Should be fun. Join us over there, madmethodpod.com/support to get links to the Patreon and the Substack. And of course, like this and subscribe and share, people.
Awesome. See you guys next time.